Hi, my name's Jeff Weiss, and I'm a partner in the International Trade Group at Venable in Washington, D.C. Welcome to this webinar on regulatory coherence in Costa Rica. This webinar is a result of an initiative undertaken by the Advanced Medical Technology Association, or ADVMed, as part of the U.S. Agency for International Development's Standards Alliance project, which is overseen by the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. The goal of the initiative is to promote regulatory coherence, and we'll get to that more in a moment, including central coordination and good regulatory practices, otherwise known as GRPs, and to provide capacity building and assistance to the governments of targeted developing countries in Latin America, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and the captive DR countries. This initiative has two components, Tier 1 and Tier 2. Under Tier 1 is the Regulatory Coherence Initiative, which is horizontal and cross-sectoral. Tier 2 is to promote regulatory coherence in the medical device sector specifically. This webinar is part of Tier 1. Now, as part of Tier 1, we've developed a formal, internationally benchmarked manual and implementation guide for policymakers to legally codify and implement foundational regulatory coherence policies in the project countries. Next, we conducted an assessment of the existing regulatory coherence policies in 4 of those countries, Costa Rica, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, against the manual and implementation guide. Based on that assessment, we developed a gap analysis report for each country in English and Spanish, as well as a flowchart demonstrating the life cycle of a typical regulation in each country. This particular webinar in the series discusses our findings with respect to Costa Rica. But before we get into the Costa Rican regulatory system, I want to provide a little bit of background on regulatory coherence. Regulatory coherence refers to the degree of central coordination and review under which the whole of government works to ensure that regulations and regulatory policy reflect good regulatory practices, or GRPs. Regulatory coherence is important because it enhances regulatory outcomes, legitimacy and predictability of a regulatory system, and helps to avoid the creation of unnecessary obstacles to trade and unnecessary regulatory differences. Regulatory coherence has 2 components: central coordination and GRPs. So first, central coordination. In order to ensure that all good regulatory practices are well understood and followed across agencies, it's critical that a government have a central coordination and oversight body or mechanism responsible for managing the regulatory process and ensuring adherence to a published set of GRPs that are endorsed at the political level, applied government-wide, and revised over time as best practices evolve, as they often do. Such a body can also ensure that there's political level buy-in and accountability on a whole of government strategy for regulatory reform that sets out clear objectives, establishes an effective implementation mechanism to coordinate and manage the strategy, and emphasizes the importance of a marketplace that is open and competitive, facilitates investment, and rewards innovation. The second part of regulatory coherence is good regulatory practices. GRPs ensure that rules and regulations are high quality and evidence-based and crafted in an open, transparent, and participatory manner. GRPs include regulatory forecasting, regulatory impact assessment, requesting public comments, taking public comments into account, assessing international impact, and ExPost review. So this is a very high-level overview of reg coherence, central coordination, and GRPs. For a fuller discussion, please check out the webinar on major elements of regulatory coherence, which is also posted on the Standards Alliance website. So let's now turn to central coordination in Costa Rica to see how Costa Rica applies these principles. So in Costa Rica, the regulatory process is overseen by the Ministry of Economy, Industry, and Commerce through its Regulatory Improvement Office, DMR. Additionally, each regulatory agency is legally required to designate an official that is responsible for the agency's regulatory improvement policies. And that official serves as a liaison between the regulator and DMR. DMR is staffed by 5 lawyers, 3 economists, and 3 support staff. The lawyers and economists are experts in regulatory improvement and on the effects of adding or modifying administrative burdens. DMR has reviewing authority only with respect to proposed regulations that add or modify an administrative burden. Its opinion regarding the administrative burdens from a proposed regulation is binding on the regulator, except if the regulator is an independent agency. So the trigger for review is if a measure adds or modifies an administrative burden. And we'll see more how that plays out later on. DMR review occurs before draft regulations are published for comment, another key factor. Now, DMR also plays a systemic coordinating function in implementing Costa Rica's regulatory improvement policies. And this is an important part of its role, which is to simplify existing procedures and avoid creating unnecessary new procedures in order to achieve an efficient and transparent public administration and eradicate corruption. Now, to play this role, DMR presides over the Institutional Committee for Regulatory Improvement. It develops training plans for regulatory improvement, and it coordinates development of agencies' annual regulatory improvement plans and posts them on the Ministry of Economy's website. So each agency needs to create a plan that includes its regulatory improvement objectives, activities, timelines, and administrative burden improvement plans. Each agency must prepare its plan by October, make it available for public comment in November, and publish the final version by December 10th. Moreover, DMR recommends modifications, simplification, or elimination of unnecessary procedures, whether they're duplicative or without legal basis, to the Regulatory Improvement Commission, or CMR. So there's a second agency involved in regulatory improvement activities in Costa Rica. So CMR also sits within the Ministry of Economy, and it's an advisory agency to the central level of government in Costa Rica. And CMR's role is to lead regulatory improvement efforts. CMR is comprised of 15 members selected by the president from both the public and private sector, including members of unions. Lastly, DMR coordinates international regulatory cooperation for Costa Rica. So this includes coordination with Mexico's Central Coordinating Authority, COFEMER. And DMR and COFEMER maintain agreements for the exchange of experiences and training on regulatory improvement. Costa Rica participates in the development of Central American technical regulations. It's in the process of becoming a member of the OECD. And as such, it's following OECD recommendations regarding regulatory improvement and attending OECD trainings. And DMR also participates in the Latin American and Caribbean Network on Good Regulatory Practices. So we've discussed DMR, and we've also discussed CMR's role on regulatory improvement. But Costa Rica's central coordination process has a very special emphasis on technical regulations, which are covered by the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade. And since we're going to talk about technical regulations, it's important to define the term. So technical regulations under WTO terminology are product regulations, regulations that set out product characteristics, related processes and production methods, related labeling and packaging requirements, and any applicable administrative provisions. The TBT agreement also covers standards, which are voluntary, as well as conformity assessment procedures, which are procedures used to determine that relevant requirements in technical regulations or standards are met. And conformity assessment procedures can include testing, inspection, registration, certification, accreditation, and combinations of those procedures. And the TBT agreement requires, for example, that countries not use such regulations to discriminate against products from other countries or between products from different countries, that they put in place regulations that take the least trade restrictive approach to achieving their legitimate objectives, that they use relevant international standards as a basis for their regulations, and that they develop such regulations through a transparent process in which they provide a meaningful opportunity for comments and take those comments into account. So DMR runs the process for reviewing non-technical regulations, but ORT, the Technical Regulation Office, runs the reg review process in Costa Rica for technical regulations. And ORT is an interministerial commission attached to the Ministry of Economy. ORT comprises 7 agencies: the Ministry of Economy, as well as the Ministries of Trade, Health, Agriculture and Livestock, Infrastructure and Transportation, Environment and Energy, and Science, Technology, and Telecommunications. ORT is also responsible for ensuring compliance with WTO rules on technical regulations and has published a guide for regulators in Costa Rica on how to develop a technical regulation. So what does ORT do specifically? So ORT has a technical secretariat, which we'll refer to as STORT, and they review draft technical regulations and issue binding opinions. Members of ORT send comments on draft technical regulations to the technical secretariat, which has to respond to the comments. STORT is also responsible for notifying draft technical regulations to the WTO for comment and runs the process for reviewing and responding to those comments. Now, DMR, as I mentioned before, which runs the process for reviewing non-technical regulations, also sends those regulations in draft to ORT for review of whether they are in fact technical regulations to make sure that nothing is missed. If ORT determines that a draft measure is a technical regulation, then ORT reviews it through its technical regulation review process. So that's central coordination and in Costa Rica. And when we go through the life cycle, we'll see a little bit more how those 3 agencies interact. So turning to the GRPs, let's start with regulatory forecasting. A regulatory forecast is a central electronic publication, ideally updated no less than once every 6 months, of all planned and ongoing regulatory activity. Now, Costa Rica does not require its regulatory agencies to prepare an annual regulatory agenda for regulations of general applicability. For technical regulations, however, regulators that are part of ORT are required to prepare a regulatory agenda for technical regulations. So in general, no annual agenda. However, the 7 agencies part of ORT, they do need to prepare an agenda for technical regulations. Once those agencies prepare their respective agendas, the Technical Secretariat of ORT and the Codex Office in the Ministry of Economy draft a 4-year national plan of technical regulations. The plan is developed with representatives of both the public and private sectors. It lists the technical subject matters that the regulators will address and possibly regulate through technical regulations during that 4-year period. Costa Rica also has a national standardization plan that lists the standards being developed by INTECO, which is Costa Rica's national standards body. Now let's turn to the issue of National Regulatory Register and see how Costa Rica adopts that GRP. So a National Regulatory Register is a central electronic publication issued with a regular frequency, usually daily or weekly, that solicits stakeholder input on all draft regulations and provides links to the full text of those regulations, as well as their associated dockets. Now, in Costa Rica, there are three main tools by which that GRP is implemented. So Costa Rica's official gazette, Diario Oficial La Gaceta, okay? Second, proposed regulations that add or modify an administrative burden can be found on the Socopre website, and that website is administered by DMR. For technical regulations, both Costa Rican technical regulations and non-Costa Rican technical regulations that may create a technical barrier to trade, they are found on the Regulatech website, which is administered by ORT. And we'll discuss how each of those tools are used in a moment. But it's also worth noting that Costa Rica also has a database of all laws and regulations on the website of the Attorney General's office. So turning to public comment in Costa Rica. For proposed regulations that do not add or modify an administrative burden, again, that's an important trigger in Costa Rica, those are open for comment on the website of the relevant agency. Proposed regulations that do add or modify an administrative burden, those are open for comment on Socopre, as well as through the relevant agency's website. Proposed technical regulations are open for comment on Regulatech, and the opportunity to submit comments must also be published in the official gazette and a national newspaper. And after the close of the domestic comment period, if ORT determines that a proposed technical regulation needs to be notified, then it's notified to the WTO. Now, taking comments into account is the next GRP. And in Costa Rica, for regulations of general applicability, regulators are not legally required to respond to stakeholder input. With respect to technical regulations, they are. Once the domestic comment period ends, the regulator needs to review and analyze all of the comments that were submitted. If the agency agrees with the comment, it incorporates the comment into the proposed technical regulation. If the agency does not agree with the comment, it must justify why it rejected the comment. And all responses are organized in a matrix that includes all the comments and their corresponding responses. In the matrix, the regulator must indicate whether the comment was accepted or rejected, and if applicable, its justification for rejecting the comment. That same process applies after the international comment period ends and a second matrix is developed. And the matrix for both the domestic period and the international comment period are made available on the Regulatech website. Now let's turn to regulatory analysis. And again, the trigger is add or modify administrative burden. So a draft regulation that doesn't do that, the regulator doesn't need to make available the evidence or analysis relied upon in developing that regulation. Now, if the draft regulation, and this includes technical regulations, adds or modifies the administrative burden, then you need to perform a regulatory impact assessment. Review of the RIA is conducted by DMR, and the regulator needs to eliminate all unnecessary procedures and administrative burdens identified by the RIA or justify those it decides to maintain. And DMR is developing an RIA form specific to technical regulations. And it's our understanding that that form will require a regulator to define the problem the proposed technical regulation will solve, identify the objective, and identify the costs and benefits of the proposal by performing a risk analysis. the regulator needs to publish elements of the RIA on Secopre, and that includes the description of the measure and the problem it would address, information on the measure's impact on administrative burdens, an explanation of the agency's legal authority, the list of approaches considered and corresponding cost-benefit analyses for those approaches, the justification for selecting the chosen option as the best alternative to solve the problem that's been identified, a discussion of how the regulator will evaluate the measure's effectiveness, which is very important, and a description of the public consultation process. And again, the regulator has to eliminate all the unnecessary procedures and administrative burdens identified by the cost-benefit assessment or justify its retention. Now let's turn to some of the other types of analysis that are GRPs and see how Costa Rica implements those, starting with science and risk analysis. So in Costa Rica, there is no requirement with respect to data quality in terms of non-technical regulations, but there are still a few important data points to mention. So when performing an analysis of the impact of a proposed technical regulation, regulators are encouraged to consider the quality of the data that they rely upon. For example, regulators are encouraged to consider the source of the information and data used, any deficiencies in the information and data used, and any possible distortions or estimates in the information and data relied on. Second, if the technical standards are international or were developed by a recognized body, they're presumed to have solid scientific support. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. With respect to the issue of risk and risk-based regulation, Costa Rica does not require a risk-based approach when developing a regulation of general applicability. However, and this is not binding on regulators, the Ministry of Economy has provided guidance on tools that agencies should use when analyzing the potential impact of a proposed technical regulation, and one of which is the use of a risk analysis. And the guidance defines a risk analysis as a combination of the probability of the risk occurring with the consequence of the risk occurring. The guidance also provides that the use of a risk-based approach is especially important when health, safety, and the environment are at stake. Turning now to competition analysis and assessment of international impacts. Costa Rica doesn't require an analysis of a draft regulation's impact on competition. Although it's not legally required, DMR sends draft regulations to the Competition Office in the Ministry of Economy for a competition analysis and opinion. And the Competition Office has to return its non-binding opinion to DMR within 5 business days. DMR also sends draft regulations to the Small Business Office in the Ministry of Economy for an opinion regarding the effects on small and medium-sized enterprises. And that office needs to return its non-binding opinion to DMR within 5 business days as well. In terms of international impact, Costa Rica doesn't require an assessment of the international impact of a proposed regulation. Although, again, it's not legally required, DMR sends a proposed regulation to ORT, to the Technical Secretariat, for its binding opinion on whether the proposed regulation is a technical regulation and for a review of possible international commitments. And the Technical Secretariat needs to return its opinion to the DMR within 5 business days. Now let's turn for a few moments to the use of standards and regulation. There is guidance in Costa Rica on the development of technical regulations that encourages regulators to select a standard that has been internationally accepted. And there is a hierarchy of standards in Costa Rica. International standards are first, and that includes Geneva-based bodies, other intergovernmental organizations, private sector bodies in which Costa Rica is a member, such as ISO and IEC. Second, regional standards. Third, national standards, and that's followed by fourth, association standards and private sector standards. For draft technical regulations, a regulator needs to prepare a study to determine whether an international standard should be adopted in whole or in part. If the international standard is adopted as a whole, it's not necessary to find technical and scientific support for the proposed technical regulation. If, however, the international standard is not adopted or only adopted in part, the regulator needs to identify the technical and scientific support that justifies and explains why the international standard is not an adequate solution to the problem identified by the draft technical regulation. So if you're not going to use an international standard as identified by Costa Rica, you're going to have to justify it with additional evidence. Next, let's discuss entry into force. Costa Rica does not require a reasonable period of time before a final regulation enters into force. Once the regulation is adopted and published in Costa Rica's official gazette, it enters into force immediately. However, there is an administrative custom in Costa Rica of providing 6 months for a technical regulation to take effect based on the WTO recommended practices. Now, in terms of ex-post review, Costa Rican law requires regulators to analyze, revise, and eliminate any administrative burdens that impede or distort transactions in either the domestic or international marketplace, unless such revisions would affect the central government's obligation to protect health, security, and the environment. Now, to this end, CMR, the Regulatory Improvement Commission, has to continuously monitor regulations. And DMR provides recommendations to CMR and coordinates the development of agency work plans, as we discussed earlier. So despite all of these processes, however, there isn't actually a formal process for ex-post assessment of regulations. So there's no process on a particular time frame like we saw in other countries. So let's put this all together and walk through the life cycle of a regulation in Costa Rica. And in Costa Rica, there are two sources of authority to regulate, and this is the same in all of the countries we looked at. The law can require an agency to regulate, or the regulator can self-initiate a regulation under its general authority. And unique to Costa Rica, among all the countries that we examined, is that there are actually two separate regulatory development processes. One for technical regulations that is overseen by ORT, and one for non-technical regulations overseen by DMR. And let's start with the process for non-technical regulations. So step one is the regulator develops a draft regulation. The regulator's staff drafts an outline. The staff is not required to do so by law, but they can consult with interested stakeholders. As they're doing that, they can create committees to draft the regulation, and they can also consult with other regulators or government institutions. The agency's legal department reviews the outline and drafts the legal text of the regulation. Next, the head of the agency reviews the draft regulation and the regulatory impact assessment, which is prepared if it adds or modifies an administrative burden. Again, that's the trigger. And then the head of the agency, after review, signs it. The regulator then uploads the draft regulation to the SECOPRE website. At this point in the process, the uploaded information is only viewable internally. It's unavailable to the public. Okay, step two, DMR reviews the draft regulation, right? So now it's been uploaded to SECOPRE and DMR has access. It reviews the draft regulation and the accompanying RIA, if there is one, to confirm whether it would add or modify an administrative burden and performs a preliminary review. If DMR finds there is no added or modified burden, that That's it for DMR review. DMR review of the measure ends at that point. If DMR does find there's going to be a new or modified burden, it sends the draft regulation to 3 offices within the Ministry of Economy for review. So it sends it to ORT, and ORT looks to see, does it comply with the relevant international obligations? And they issue a binding opinion on whether the draft regulation is a technical regulation. And if it is, then it has to go through ORT's review process for technical regulations, which we'll get to in a few minutes. The Competition Office in the Ministry of Economy also gets a copy and does a competition analysis and issues a non-binding opinion on the draft regulation on the competition angle. And then third, the Small Business Office in the Ministry of Economy takes a look at the draft measure, and it issues a non-binding opinion on the effects of the draft regulation on SMEs. Step 3, DMR requests public comments on the draft regulation. The comment period is a minimum of 10 business days, and it's not legally required, but the agency generally responds to the public comments on Secopre within 10 days after the comment period closes. Step 4, DMR reviews the draft measure and comments. So it reviews the measure in light of the public comments and issues an opinion on the administrative burdens of the measure. Now, if the regulator is part of the executive branch, the opinion that DMR issues is binding. However, if the regulator is an independent agency, the opinion is non-binding. So all the agencies, independent or not, are going through this process, and then we get to this point, and then DMR's view is either binding or not, depending on that variable. Step 5, DMR's opinion is published on Secopre. So if that opinion requires minor changes to the draft, the agency needs to make the changes, again, unless it's independent. If the opinion requires substantial changes to the draft, the agency needs to make them, and DMR reviews again. Step 6, the final regulation is reviewed. If it's a decree, the agency needs to send it to the president's office for signature. If it's another type of regulation, so if it's not a decree, it goes to the head of the agency for final approval. And then step 7, the final regulation is published in the official gazette, enters into force either immediately or the date specified in the regulation. So that's the life cycle of a non-technical regulation in Costa Rica. Now I'm going to take you through the life cycle of a technical regulation in Costa Rica. So the first step in that process is the regulator has to analyze the problem. Is the technical regulation the only solution to the problem, or are there non-regulatory, more efficient, or less costly alternatives capable of solving the problem? Once it's identified the problem, the regulator must clearly and precisely outline the purpose and objective of the proposed technical regulation. And throughout the entire development process for the technical regulation, the purpose and objective of the proposed technical regulation must always be taken into consideration so that the requirements and administrative burden that it creates are directly related to the objectives. Although it doesn't provide specifics, the domestic technical regulation development guide that was developed by the Ministry of Economy encourages the agency that's proposing the technical regulation to make the proposal available to interested stakeholders and involve other regulators that would be affected by the proposed technical regulation. Again, this is before putting it out for comment. This is as the measure is being developed. So the second step is the regulator needs to analyze its legal authority. And as part of its analysis, the regulator needs to determine the scope of its regulatory authority. Second, it needs to identify if other agencies have regulatory authority over the same matter. Third, it needs to review existing technical regulations to determine whether there is a technical regulation that already regulates the matter. So if there's an existing technical regulation covering the same matter as the proposal, and it solves the problem that's been identified, then the tech reg is unnecessary. If an existing tech reg covers a similar but not the same matter or is out of date, then the regulator needs to examine whether to modify the existing technical regulation rather than developing a new one. If there is no existing tech reg that covers the same matter, then the regulator needs to develop a new tech reg. So fourth, they need to review existing domestic laws as part of the legal analysis, including Attorney General and Supreme Court opinions. And fifth, they need to review existing foreign technical regulations by reviewing existing technical regulations of countries similar to Costa Rica or any comparative studies or existing tech regs developed by an international organization. Step 3, the regulator drafts the proposed technical regulation. So if you've determined after all that analysis that a technical regulation is necessary, you need to identify the areas in which the proposed tech reg will potentially have an impact to determine which stakeholders should be involved in the process. And that could include ministries, the private sector, academia, and consumer groups. Participation by a ministry will depend on the ministry's legal authority and the type of technical regulation proposed. So, for example, if the proposed technical regulation regulates quality and consumer information, then the Ministry of Economy will want to be and will need to be involved. In terms of involving the private sector, chambers and associations, for instance, the members of the chamber or association that is selected by the regulator to participate needs to comprise at least 80% of the represented sector. So you need to make sure the group is representative. And members of academic institutions should also be included in this process when they possess extensive knowledge on the product that will be regulated. Now let's turn to the process for drafting the technical regulation. And this is specifically focusing on the technical and scientific analysis required. So to research the technical and scientific support for the proposed technical regulation, the regulator needs to avail itself of all possible sources of information. Additionally, it should always be a priority for the regulator to select a standard that has been internationally accepted, since it's presumed to have solid scientific support. And you remember the hierarchy that we discussed earlier. And you'll recall that for a proposed technical regulation, the regulator needs to prepare a study to determine whether the relevant international standard should be adopted in whole or in part. If it's adopted in its entirety, you don't need to find technical and scientific support to use it in the technical regulation. If the standard is partially adopted or not adopted at all, the regulator needs to identify the technical and scientific support that justifies that decision and explains why the international standard is not an adequate solution to the problem. In those cases, the regulator needs to analyze existing scientific studies regarding the product that will be regulated, with a view towards using those studies as a basis for the proposed technical regulation. The regulator needs to study and verify the market, including by visiting producers. And it needs to perform a statistical analysis of the market studies to determine their reliability. So in sum, under the TR development system, the system for developing tech regs in Costa Rica, there's a tremendous incentive for a regulator to use a standard recognized as international by Costa Rica. Much less analysis is required. And there is a huge disincentive to using it only in part and or deviating from it, including through the use of another standard. So in addition to the technical and scientific analysis, the regulator needs to determine whether the new requirements, administrative burdens, or procedures are legally permissible. Any new requirements or administrative burdens established by the proposed technical regulation must not be unnecessary or duplicative. They must be strictly necessary to ensure the proposed technical regulation's objective is fulfilled. They can't limit free market competition or create a barrier to trade and entry, and they need to be supported by a scientific, legal, and technical basis. In addition, the agency needs to demonstrate that it has adequate staff and budget to enforce the requirements of the proposed tech reg. The regulator must then convene interested stakeholders to form a technical working group and reach a consensus. And in cases where it feels that a technical working group is unnecessary, the regulator must justify its decision not to convene one. So let's turn now to step 4, which is when ORT analyzes the draft technical regulation. So the regulators now finished drafting. In step 3, step 4, they submit the draft to ORT, to the technical secretariat of ORT for review. At that point in the process, the members of ORT, right, there's 7 agencies, they can send comments on the draft tech reg to STORT, and the tech secretariat has to respond to the comments. After its review, STORT renders an opinion on the draft technical regulation. If the draft is legally permissible, and that's not just legally permissible from a domestic context, but also with respect to Costa Rica's international obligations, STORT recommends that ORT propose the draft technical regulation for public comment. Now, if the technical secretariat gives an opinion that the draft tech reg will not adhere to international obligations, then the regulator needs to modify the proposed technical regulation accordingly. Step 5, ORT publishes the draft technical regulation for comment on Reglatech and in the official Gazette for a minimum comment period of 10 business days. Now, this is the domestic comment period. So the comments are submitted. Step 6, the regulator reviews and responds to the public comments. Analyzes the comments. If the regulator agrees with the comment, it incorporates it into the proposal. If the agency disagrees with the comment, it needs to justify why it rejected the comment. And as we mentioned before, all the responses are organized in a matrix, including the comments and their corresponding responses. If complicated comments are received, the tech secretariat of ORT transmits them back to the technical working group for examination, and they have to respond to the comments that are duly substantiated. After the end of the domestic comment period, ORT then has to make a determination as to whether the measure must also be notified to the WTO. If it doesn't, the final tech reg is signed and published in the official Gazette. All technical regulations are decrees, so they need to be signed by both the agency head and the president before they are published. Now, if the technical regulation does need to be notified, we move to step 7. In step 7, STORT notifies the draft technical regulation to the WTO for the international public comment period. They also notify it to other countries with which Costa Rica has free trade agreements. And there's a 60-day international public comment period. WTO members can comment on the proposed technical regulation and may also request to extend the comment period through the WTO website. Step 8, the regulator reviews and responds to the international public comments. STORT compiles the comments received and sends them to the regulator. The regulator reviews and analyzes all the comments. Again, if the regulator agrees with the comment, it's incorporated into the proposal and as it becomes final. If the agency does not agree with the comment, it has to justify its rejection of the comment. And all responses are organized in a matrix that includes the comments and corresponding responses. So there's the matrix for domestic comments, the matrix for international comments. The regulator needs to reply to the comments within 30 business days and submit the matrix to STORT so that ORT can make the matrix available on the website of the Ministry of Economy. Step 9, the final technical regulation is signed and published. Again, all technical regulations are decrees, so they need to be signed by the head of the regulator and the president. The RT published in Costa Rica's official gazette and enters into force. So a few short closing thoughts on Costa Rica. It's going to be interesting to see what, if any, changes Costa Rica makes to its regulatory system as part of its OECD accession process. So will they create a more formal ex-post review process? Will we see a new RIA form for technical regulations that require a risk analysis? That's something that they're working on. Will there be new opportunities for international regulatory cooperation? For example, through development of Central American technical regulations. Costa Rica is a primary driver of those. So it should be an interesting couple of years in the evolution of Costa Rica's regulatory system, and we'll be watching closely. So thanks for watching this webinar. This concludes the presentation on regulatory coherence in Costa Rica. Thanks also to AdvaMed and ANSI for making this all possible, and to Aguilar y Luera in Mexico City, which provided invaluable assistance to Venable on this project. In closing, I'd like to note that the webinar is posted on the Standards Alliance website, standardsalliance.ansi.org, along with other related webinars in this series. So you'll be able to find there the manual and implementation guide on good regulatory design, and that provides more details on central coordination and GRPs, the complete analyses of the 4 regulatory systems, Costa Rica, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, plus the United States, documents that set out the life cycle of a regulation in each of those 5 countries, and the slide decks and transcripts from all the webinars in English and Spanish. If after reviewing the materials you have additional questions or would like to discuss further, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on the last slide. Thanks again, and have a great day.